There's a specific kind of chaos that takes over an airbase when a fighter jet, mid-taxi, suddenly has no qualified pilot able to fly it. And 6 other aircraft on that same runway are seconds away from a genuine catastrophic collision. I've spoken with someone who was on that flight line the day it happened. They told me the same thing 3 different times, like they still couldn't quite believe it themselves. Nobody thought to look at the maintenance crew. Nobody thought the answer to an unfolding disaster might be standing right there in a grease-stained jumpsuit, tools still in hand. They were about to find out exactly how wrong that assumption was. If you love stories about people standing in plain sight who nobody bothers to actually see, hit subscribe before we go any further. That's the entire reason this channel exists. And tonight, I want you playing along with me. Somewhere in this story, before I explain exactly who she used to be, you're going to start guessing. When it clicks, drop it in the comments. Let's rewind about 8 months, because you need to understand exactly how invisible this woman had become before we get anywhere near that runway. Her name for tonight's story was Airman First Class Priya Chandra, 29 years old. Assigned to the ground maintenance crew at a mid-sized airbase, working long shifts on the flight line. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters to how this story lands. Nobody on that base was cruel to Priya. Nobody mocked her or excluded her deliberately. What happened to her was quieter than that, and in its own way, more common. The specific, slow erosion of visibility that happens to people whose job keeps them working with their hands on machines rather than standing at podiums or flying in formation. Maintenance crews, on most bases, exist in a kind of structural background, essential and almost completely unseen at the same time. For 8 months, Priya had done her job with quiet, careful competence. The kind of methodical thoroughness that keeps aircraft genuinely safe but rarely earns anyone much notice. She kept to herself during breaks, ate lunch alone more often than not. She moved through her shifts with the specific, practiced efficiency of someone who has learned that doing the job well matters considerably more than being noticed for it. Here's a question I want you sitting with while we go tonight. How many people do you walk past every single day whose actual skills and history you've never once bothered to ask about? Hold that thought. We're going to need it. What nobody on that base knew, because it simply never came up, was that Priya Chandra had spent 4 years as a fully qualified fighter pilot, trained through one of the most demanding advanced tactical flight programs her branch offered. Before a service-related medical condition, diagnosed partway through an exceptional flying career, had permanently grounded her from active flight duty. The condition itself wasn't something she discussed openly, not out of shame, but because it was simply a private medical fact to her. She'd been given the choice at the point of her diagnosis to leave the service entirely, or to remain in uniform in a different capacity. She'd chosen the latter, specifically requesting reassignment to aircraft maintenance, a role that let her stay close to exactly the machines she'd once flown, even though she could no longer fly them herself. It's worth sitting with the quiet weight of that decision for a second. She could have left. Many people would have. Instead, she chose to stay near the work she loved, without ever once mentioning to her new colleagues exactly what she'd given up to be there. None of that traveled with her onto that flight line. All anyone saw was a quiet maintenance technician, and that became the entire understanding the base settled on. That brings us to the afternoon that changed everything. The incident started with something that should have been routine. A pilot preparing to taxi out for a scheduled training flight experienced a sudden, serious medical emergency in the cockpit. He collapsed at the controls just as his aircraft was moving into position on an active runway shared with 5 other jets. The aircraft, without a conscious pilot at the controls, continued rolling forward under its own momentum, drifting directly into the path of the other aircraft. For a genuinely terrifying stretch of seconds, the situation looked like it was building toward a catastrophic multi-aircraft collision. Ground control was screaming instructions over the radio. Emergency vehicles were already beginning to scramble. The only person capable of stopping that aircraft was unconscious at the controls. Getting a qualified pilot physically into that cockpit in time felt, to everyone watching, like an almost impossible race against seconds that simply weren't there. Priya was working on a separate aircraft nearby when the emergency began unfolding. According to 2 witnesses, her reaction once she understood what was actually happening was almost instantaneous. She dropped her tools, ran directly toward the drifting aircraft. Without waiting for anyone's authorization, without a single moment of hesitation, she climbed onto the taxiing jet and pulled herself into the cockpit alongside the unconscious pilot. I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because I think it's the emotional center of this entire story. 4 years since she'd last flown a fighter aircraft. 4 years of maintenance work and a base full of colleagues who had no idea what she'd once been capable of. And in the space of about 10 seconds, none of that mattered anymore. Every single thing Priya had once been trained to do came back online at once, completely, instinctively, like it had never actually left her. What followed over the next roughly 90 seconds became one of the most talked about incidents that base had on record in years. Priya, working the controls alongside the unconscious pilot, regained control of the aircraft's taxi trajectory. She steered it safely away from the other cued jets, bringing it to a controlled, complete stop well clear of any collision. All while simultaneously managing the medical emergency unfolding in the seat beside her. She called for immediate medical assistance over the radio with a clarity and precision that ground control described afterward as someone who clearly knew exactly what she was doing. Emergency crews reached the aircraft within moments of it coming to a stop, extracting the unconscious pilot and getting him into immediate medical care. Doctors reviewing his case afterward specifically credited that intervention with contributing meaningfully to his full recovery. The 5 other aircraft on that runway, seconds away from a potentially catastrophic collision path, were able to safely reposition once the drifting jet came to a stop. Base leadership described the outcome as narrowly avoiding what could have been one of the worst accidents in that base's operational history. I want you to picture the scene on that flight line once everything had stabilized. According to witnesses, it took a genuinely stunned, almost surreal several minutes for anyone to process exactly what they'd just watched. The quiet maintenance technician nobody had thought to look at twice in 8 months had just single-handedly prevented a disaster. A disaster every trained pilot and ground controller on that base had, for a handful of agonizing seconds, genuinely believed was already happening. Base leadership moved quickly to review Priya's full service record, a record that left more than one senior officer sitting with the same uncomfortable realization. One of the most exceptional pilots that particular training program had ever produced had spent the previous 8 months on their own base, working quietly on the ground. The base commander met with Priya personally in the days that followed, not to reprimand her, but because, as he reportedly told a colleague, "You don't let something like this go unacknowledged." Priya, according to witnesses, handled the sudden attention with the same understated composure she'd carried through her entire 8 months on that base. She was more interested in confirming that the pilot she'd helped save was going to recover than in discussing her own role in the incident. What followed in the weeks afterward was a meaningful, if quiet, shift in how the base engaged with her. She was offered and accepted an expanded role working closely with pilots on tactical training scenarios and simulator instruction, a position that let her contribute her genuine expertise in a way 8 months of pure maintenance work never had. What stays with me most about this story isn't really the 90 seconds of that emergency, remarkable as they were. It's the 8 months before it. 8 months of a genuinely exceptional pilot working quietly on the ground, choosing to stay close to the work anyway. She never needed the recognition. It took a genuine, terrifying emergency to remind an entire base that the skills she'd once had never actually left her. They were just waiting, quietly, for the one moment they'd be needed again. So here's my question for you tonight, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Do you think it's on all of us to make more effort to actually get to know the people doing quiet, essential work around us? Or do you think some of this invisibility is simply unavoidable in a place with that many moving parts? And tell me the other thing too. Before I explained her background, had you already started suspecting this maintenance technician was carrying a flying history nobody on that base knew about? If this story kept you here tonight, subscribe before you go, because this channel exists entirely for exactly this kind of story. The quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones whose skill saves the day the second it's actually needed. And if you've got a story like Priya's, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.